Hey there, guys. Alright, today we are back with the Great War. And this time we're on to week 12, learning from Napoleon, Russia, the underestimated enemy. Before we dive into the video, though, make sure you go check out the links below in the description box. Got a new link there if you haven't noticed it for the past couple weeks. Finally got the Discord up. After, I think, saying for over a year that I would be making one eventually. I did it. Kind of nothing special about the Discord now. Right now, it's just a place to hang out. So make sure you go click that link and join it. But yeah, aside from that, let's go ahead and dive right into the video.
So far this war, things had looked grim for the Russians. They had unwillingly entered the war in the first place, and the colossal defeats at the battles of Tannenberg and Masurian Lakes had convinced the German and Austro-Hungarian armies that Russia's army was both backward and incompetent. But beginning this week, they would learn that Russia was no pushover at all and had two enviable assets: men and space.
Got lots of men. They're a big fucking nation, dude. We got the space.
I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. Last week we saw Antwerp fall to the Germans, and the Belgians and the British retreated into Flanders to build their defenses and try to prevent the Germans from pushing to the sea, while the French held the line further south. In the east, the Austrians were under siege in their fortress at Przemyśl, awaiting relief. The Russians further north were marching to positions to cross the Vistula and attack Germany, and the Germans were now only 20 kilometers from Warsaw. Here was the general German plan in the east: to strike, with Austrian help, at Warsaw and Ivangorod and outflank the Russian army there, while the Austrians were being relieved from the siege further south. The Russians, after weeks of disastrous marching through the mud, had finally reached their crossing point, built a bridgehead, and began to cross. The Germans reached Warsaw on October 12th, but their attacks were thrown back, and there would be no outflanking. See, the Germans had seen the Russian march and its colossal mismanagement and believed that Russia was weak around Warsaw. But what they didn't realize was that the Russian armies were arriving and entering the battle in sections, and more of them were coming. So we see that before October 15th, the Germans had the upper hand, but after that, not so much. Soon there was no prospect of German General von Hindenburg getting a decisive victory in view of the seemingly endless Russian reinforcements, now coming from as far away as Central Asia and Siberia.
Damn.
It's important to realize that by this point, there were actually four fronts in the east: German-Russian in East Prussia, German-Russian-Austrian along the Vistula, Russian-Austrian along the San, and Russian-Austrian in the Carpathians, and the middle two of those were now a concerted operation. So, along the San River, the Austrians had finally managed to break out, relieved by General Boroyevich von Bonya on October the 11th.
That's a name.
Now this...
What is that first? Svetozar? That is a Hungarian name. That is not an Austrian. But he's got an Austrian last name, von Bonya. Well, the Bonya is Hungarian, kind of sounding. I'm trying to look at him, look at his name, figure out which nationality he is. He's got to be Hungarian. Yeah.
This was timed to coincide with Hindenburg's German advances towards Warsaw further north. Boroyevich, eventually a field marshal, was a brilliant defensive strategist who later showed what he could do on the Italian front. But for now, he had to deal with his chief...
Wait, the Austrians actually have a competent general? Where has he been this whole time?
...staff, Konrad von Hotzendorf. Konrad thought that the combined forces of the Austrians from within Przemyśl and Boroyevich's relief army could beat the Russians. So on October 14th, he ordered his men to try and cross the San River and engage the enemy. It was a catastrophe. His men were bombarded not only by the Russians, but also by their own side because of miscommunication. And there were no pontoons to make bridges, so they had to use boats to ferry themselves over. And since one of the Austrian commanders thought a marching band might improve morale, he had one playing on the Austrian shore. Now imagine being one of those poor Austrian soldiers trying to cross the river in a boat while being bombarded by both the enemy and your own men. Your comrades are dying around you by the dozens while a marching band on the shore plays inspiring music for you. It was truly a scene from a madhouse. So now that we've imagined being an Austrian soldier, let's imagine that we live in Poland in October 1914. The Germans march in, then the Russians, sometimes the Austrians, then the Germans again, back and forth and up and down. By now, the basic situation in the towns of Russian Poland was total anarchy. At least the German officers had some training in civic leadership, which their Russian counterparts lacked completely. There sprang up a huge black market in this region for liquor and food, as you may guess, but also weapons, uniforms, anything that the locals could scavenge from a battlefield, or sadly, get from a soldier in exchange for food. Even winter clothes, with winter soon here. Really, the troops were so desperate for food, they were selling their winter boots, knowing that Russian winter was coming in just a few short weeks. Another effect of anarchy in Russian Poland was that when the German troops arrived, the local populations often turned against the Jews, claiming they were secretly sympathetic to the German cause, and they began a series of atrocities against them. Shops and synagogues were looted and burned, and Jews were hanged every day. The idea, though, that Jews were sympathetic to the German cause totally ignored the fact that 250,000 Jews were serving in the Russian army at the time. And that army was finally beginning to turn itself around, not only because of its enormous size, but because Russia had a way of approaching battle that none of the other warring nations had. See, Russia had no problem giving up land to the enemy and using space to fight a war instead of just force. This had always held true. Think of Napoleon marching on Russia 100 years ago and the disaster it ended in for him. Russia had thousands upon thousands of miles of land, and if the enemy made some gains or even took a whole province, so what? It would simply be retaken when the enemy stretched itself too thin and became exhausted. And how does an enemy counter this when the enemy can't think like that? None of the other armies had that luxury. It was immoral for the Germans to cede any of East Prussia to the Russians. It was humiliating for the Austrians that Russia now held Austrian ground and cities, and it was absolutely unthinkable for the Belgians and the French to give up an inch of their land to the Germans in the West, where the war for a decisive victory was now a war for roads, villages, and hills. The race to the sea had been going on for weeks as the Germans tried to outflank the British, French, and Belgians, and vice versa. The trench lines grew ever longer as neither side was able to gain an advantage, and both sides were forced to dig in. Battles that would rage for weeks began in places like La Bassée, Armentières, and Messines as the lines grew further and further north. On the 11th, the Germans began bombarding Lille, which surrendered on the 13th and would remain in German hands for the next 4 years. This part of France and Belgium, called Flanders,
it's just still, and it's just crazy really to think of how stagnant the Western Front is for this whole war. It's still hard to picture, no matter how many times you're told it, at least for me. Right? You've got these long, like these trench lines are covering hundreds of miles, and there are battles that cost the lives of hundreds of thousands, of, like tens of thousands of soldiers in like single day. And still, despite the sheer like apocalyptic numbers that these armies are suffering in terms of casualty battle, they don't make any progress, and that's just so unfathomable. This is like the one time this happens in war, because we don't see this in World War II because no one wants to fight that war again, really. However, really, the French and British actually wanted to force the Germans into that kind of style of fighting again in World War II because, you know, that's what won them the World War I the first time, so they thought it would work again the second. But the Germans were like, fuck no, we are not playing that game. You know what happened. But yeah, we have not seen another war kind of stagnate World War One. It really stands alone. Which is why part of the reason why I kind of enjoy is not the right word when talking about war. That's what makes, I'm gonna be honest, I found World War II history boring. World War I history interesting. I think World War I is definitely one of the most interesting wars to study.
Was still mostly untouched by the war, and when, on October 14th, some British forces entered the town of Ypres, it seemed like a nice quiet little country town. They promptly began calling it Wipers. The next day, they marched east a few miles and made preparations to make a quick advance on the Germans as soon as the rest of the British Expeditionary Force turned up. No one realized yet that this quaint little patch of Belgian countryside would become the gravesite for over 200,000 British soldiers during the next 4 years. British soldiers were going to a watery grave this week as well, as the German submarine U-9, already infamous for dispatching 3 British cruisers in 1 hour, torpedoed the Hawk in the North Sea. 525 British sailors drowned. Only 21 were saved. However, as the war in the seas grew and developed, the British gained a lucky advantage. Russia sent them a German Navy signal book it had captured when the German signalman about to destroy it was killed by an artillery shell. Because of this, British cryptographers in future had a leg up decoding wireless messages and finding their adversaries at sea. So there we are at the end of the week, with the British arriving at a nice quiet town called Ypres at the northern end of the miles and miles of trenches. The Austrians sinking into despair as their maneuvers once again proved disastrous. The Germans realizing that Russia was nowhere near as incompetent as they'd thought, and the Russians bringing more.
The Austro-Hungarians, even more incompetent than you previously thought.
And more, and ever more men to bear down on the Germans along the Vistula River. Germany and Austria knew, of course, that Russia had the population advantage, but they'd gone to war confident that their advantages in tactics and equipment would more than make up for this. And for the Germans, at least so far, it had. But nobody quite realized the depth of the Russian reinforcements. And as the enemy army's initial forces were depleted, that depth, as well as the use of the endless open space, had finally made the Russian army a real force to be reckoned with. And over the next 2 months, hundreds of thousands of men would die on the enormous battlefields of the Eastern Front. If you'd like to see how the trench warfare developed in this war, check out.
And that was Learning from Napoleon, Russia, the underestimated enemy. Great War, Week 12. Hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more. I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.